It started as a typical morning in the classroom. Quiet chatter, the rustling of papers, and the hum of teachers trying to keep their students focused. But in one particular class, things were about to take an unexpected turn. A teacher, who prided herself on maintaining order, found herself struggling with one student in particular. He had a habit of getting distracted, his hands constantly moving, his attention drifting. Frustrated, she tried to find a way to keep him still, and that's when the unthinkable happened. In a moment of irritation, she grabbed the nearest thing, her bottle of glue, and, without thinking, applied a generous amount to the boy's hair, intending to stop his constant fidgeting. But instead of calming him down, she had created an enormous mess. His hair clung together in sticky, tangled strands, and before anyone could react, the damage was done. The teacher, momentarily stunned, tried to laugh it off, assuming it was a minor blunder that would be easily fixed. However, what she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the boy she had just treated so carelessly wasn't just any student. His father, the one who ran the whole school, the principal, was about to find out. The boy sat there in silence, not yet aware of the consequences that would unfold when he was sent to the principal's office to get his hair cleaned up. The tension in the air was thick as the teacher, unaware of the storm approaching, continued her day, oblivious to the storm she had just triggered. Would the principal's reaction be one of forgiveness, or would this seemingly small mistake lead to a much bigger consequence? The boy sat in the office waiting for his father, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the hall as his mind raced. He had always been the quiet one, the one who avoided attention at all costs. But now, here he was, in the principal's office, for something that was entirely out of his control. His hands nervously twisted together as he stared at the floor, the sticky mess in his hair the least of his worries. What would his father say? What would happen to the teacher? Would he be punished for something he had no part in? The door creaked open, and there stood his father, the principal of the school, his face a mask of calm. He didn't immediately look at the boy. Instead, his gaze swept over the mess on the desk, the glint of the glue bottle still visible. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. This was it. He could feel his father's eyes settle on him, a quiet intensity in the air. "Come here, son," the principal said, his voice steady but tinged with something the boy couldn't quite place. The boy stood slowly, dragging his feet toward his father, who, without a word, gently ran his fingers through the sticky hair. The boy flinched, but didn't pull away. He had learned long ago that when his father was upset, it was best to stay still. "What happened?" the principal asked, though his tone was more curious than angry. The boy hesitated, unsure of how to answer. How could he explain the accident? He didn't want to get the teacher in trouble, but he knew that this situation was bigger than just a simple mess. His father had a reputation at the school, one that was built on respect, authority, and a no-nonsense attitude. No one dared cross him. No one. "It was just an accident," the boy finally muttered, his voice barely audible. "She was trying to help me focus, and she grabbed the glue." The principal's expression didn't change, but the boy could see the wheels turning in his father's mind. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. The boy wished the ground would swallow him up, wished this moment would end. He hated being the center of attention, especially in front of his father. But this was different. This was serious. "I see," the principal said slowly, his eyes never leaving the boy's hair. "And you didn't do anything to provoke this?" "No, sir," the boy replied quickly. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I swear." The principal nodded, though the boy wasn't sure if he was reassured. His father wasn't the type to show emotions easily, and when he did, it was usually a sign that something had gone horribly wrong. The boy wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified by the way his father was handling the situation. He had expected anger, maybe even a shout or two. But instead, his father remained eerily calm. "What's her name?" the principal asked, still looking at the boy's hair as if lost in thought. The boy hesitated. He didn't want to get anyone in trouble, especially not his teacher. She had always been nice to him, and he knew that this wasn't something she would have done on purpose. But at the same time, he knew his father wasn't someone who could let such a mistake slide. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. The principal nodded again, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Miss Carter, I'll take care of this." He paused, and for the first time, his eyes softened just slightly as he looked at the boy. "Don't worry. I'll make sure this is handled properly." The boy nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. His father's promise didn't always guarantee a solution. In fact, it often meant that things would get worse before they got better. The principal's reputation was built on order, discipline, and keeping things running smoothly. And when things went off track, the consequences were always swift. As the principal turned to leave, he looked over his shoulder, his gaze locking with the boy's for a brief moment. "You stay here," he said, his tone firm. "I'll be right back." The boy watched as his father stepped out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him. His stomach twisted into knots, the tension too thick to ignore. He had never seen his father so serious, not even when he'd gotten into trouble as a child. Usually, the principal was all about rules and discipline, but there was something else in his eyes now, something the boy couldn't quite place. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps returning. He stood up, feeling his heart race again. This was it. His father was coming back, and whatever happened next, he knew it was going to change everything. The door opened, and the principal stepped back into the room, his expression unreadable. Behind him, Miss Carter stood, her face pale, her eyes wide. The boy's stomach dropped. What had his father said to her? What was going to happen now? Miss Carter avoided the boy's gaze, looking instead at the floor, her hands wringing together nervously. She looked like a person who had been caught in a lie, but the boy couldn't understand why. What was the big deal? It was just glue, after all. The principal motioned for Miss Carter to sit down. She did so, her movements stiff. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the slow ticking of the clock on the wall. The boy's nerves were on edge, the silence unbearable. Finally, his father spoke, his voice low and controlled. "I want you to explain to me how this happened," the principal said, addressing Miss Carter. She hesitated, glancing at the boy before turning her gaze back to his father. "It was an accident," she said quickly, her voice shaky. "I was just trying to calm him down. And I didn't mean to." The principal raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't mean to, but you did. And now my son is sitting here with his hair glued together. How are we going to fix this?" Miss Carter's face flushed with embarrassment, and she fidgeted in her seat. I can fix it. I'll clean him up, and I'll make sure nothing like this happens again." The principal's gaze hardened. "You better. This isn't just a matter of glue in someone's hair. This is about responsibility. You're here to teach, not to make mistakes that affect my family." The tension in the room was thick, and the boy could feel it closing in on him, suffocating him. He wanted to speak, to defend his teacher, but the words wouldn't come. He knew that if he said anything, it would make things worse. He had to stay quiet. His father's eyes flicked to him, and for a brief moment, their gazes met. It was as if his father was trying to read him, to see if he was upset, if he felt betrayed. But the boy didn't know what to say. He didn't know what to feel. The room fell into another heavy silence as the principal turned back to Miss Carter. The decision, whatever it would be, was coming, and for the boy, there was nothing he could do to change it. The air in the office felt colder, heavier, as the principal stared at Miss Carter. His silence was the loudest thing in the room. Every second stretched on like an eternity. The boy shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between his father and his teacher. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was unfolding, and he was powerless to stop it. Miss Carter sat there, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes avoiding everyone's gaze. She looked as though she were bracing for impact, but nothing was happening fast enough to relieve the tension. She had apologized. She had promised to clean the mess, but none of that seemed to make a difference to the principal. His expression remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that was almost suffocating. The boy's thoughts raced. Was his father going to fire Miss Carter? Was she going to lose her job over a mistake? He knew it had been an accident, but what if his father didn't see it that way? His father had a reputation for being tough, for making swift decisions without hesitation. But this was his teacher. This was the woman who had taught him to read, who had helped him when he was struggling with his lessons. Could his father really punish her so harshly for one mistake? The thought made the boy's stomach churn. He didn't want to see anyone lose their job, especially someone who had always been kind to him. He had no idea how to make his father see things differently. He didn't know what to say, or even if it was his place to say anything at all. Finally, the principal spoke, his voice cold and deliberate. "Miss Carter, accidents happen. But this is not the first time we've had problems with your teaching methods. There have been complaints from other students, distractions, lack of focus, difficulty managing the classroom." The boy felt his heart sink. Complaints? What complaints? He hadn't heard anything about it. His mind began to spin, piecing together the possibility that this wasn't just about the glue incident. It felt like it was about something bigger, something deeper. Was this just the final straw? Was his teacher's job really on the line? Miss Carter's face paled even further, her lips trembling as she struggled to find words. I didn't know about the complaints," she stammered. "I swear, I'm trying my best, but I didn't mean to upset anyone. I never meant for anything like this to happen." The boy could see her distress. Her eyes were wide, her hands shaking. She was genuinely scared, and for the first time, the boy felt a flicker of sympathy for her. She didn't deserve to lose her job over a simple mistake, but what could he do? His father was the principal. He had the power to decide what happened next. The principal's eyes narrowed, his gaze still piercing. Trying your best doesn't always cut it in a classroom. You're here to teach, to keep control, to ensure things run smoothly. If you can't do that, there are consequences. And I'm not talking about a slap on the wrist, Miss Carter. I'm talking about real repercussions. The boy's breath caught in his throat. His father's words hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. He had never heard him speak like this, not about a teacher, not about anyone. His father was usually calm, composed, methodical in his decisions. But now, there was something sharp in his voice, something that made the boy's chest tighten with fear. The principal wasn't just angry. He was disappointed. Disappointed in Miss Carter, in the way things had been handled, in the way the school had been slipping. The boy's mind raced, his emotions a whirlwind. He wanted to stand up, to speak out, to defend Miss Carter. But what could he say? What good would it do? His father had already made up his mind. The tension in the room was so thick it was suffocating, and every second seemed to drag on endlessly. He turned his gaze to Miss Carter, who was now visibly on the edge of tears. Her face was flushed with embarrassment, her shoulders hunched in defeat. The boy felt a pang of guilt. He didn't want this to happen to her. He didn't want anyone to suffer because of something that was, at the end of the day, just a mistake. But the way his father was speaking, the way he was laying out the facts, it didn't look good. There was no room for mistakes when it came to his father's school. The rules were strict, and the consequences were always harsh. "Miss Carter," the principal said, his voice softening just a fraction, though there was still a bite to his words. "I want you to understand something. This isn't just about the glue or about you being unable to control your classroom. This is about trust. You've been entrusted with these students' futures, and when something like this happens, trust is broken." The boy felt his heart race. Trust. His father's words echoed in his mind. It felt like the world was closing in on him, like everything around him was spiraling out of control. He had never seen his father like this, never seen him so angry, so disappointed. It was as if the teacher's mistake wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of something bigger, something that had been building up for a long time. And the boy had no idea how to stop it. Miss Carter, her voice barely a whisper, spoke again. "I understand. I won't make excuses. I just need another chance. I promise I'll do better. I'll fix everything. Just please, don't fire me." Her plea was desperate, her words heavy with the weight of the situation. The boy's heart went out to her. He had never seen someone so vulnerable, so powerless. And in that moment, he realized that there was something he needed to do, something he had to try. But what? What could he say to change his father's mind? The principal was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on Miss Carter, his expression unreadable. The boy's anxiety grew with every passing second. He couldn't bear to watch this unfold. He couldn't stand the thought of Miss Carter losing everything because of one mistake. Finally, the principal spoke again, his voice lower now, almost too calm. "I'm not going to fire you today, Miss Carter, but make no mistake, this is your last chance. You will not get another opportunity to make a mistake like this. If it happens again, I won't hesitate." Miss Carter nodded fervently, her eyes wide with relief, but the boy couldn't relax just yet. His father's words hung in the air, a warning. The consequences were still there, lingering like a shadow, and the boy couldn't help but wonder how long it would be before everything came crashing down. The tension in the room didn't lift, even as Miss Carter breathed a sigh of relief. Her shoulders sagged, and for a fleeting moment, the boy almost believed that everything might settle back into normalcy. But the unsettling weight of his father's words hung in the air, like a storm cloud that wouldn't pass. "Your last chance," the principal had said, and something in the boy's gut told him that his father wasn't the type to let it go so easily. The warning wasn't just for Miss Carter. It felt like it was for everyone in this room, including him. The boy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His mind raced, replaying the events that had led them here. The glue, the teacher's panic, the silence. His father was a man of rules, a man of control. He didn't make decisions lightly. But there was something about the way his father had spoken today, something off in his tone, that made the boy uneasy. What was truly going on here? Why did it feel like there was more at play than a simple classroom accident? As the principal turned to leave the office, a chill swept over the room, and the boy caught a glimpse of Miss Carter's face, her eyes wide, her mouth set in a tight line, as if she were holding back something she desperately wanted to say. Before she could speak, the door swung open again, this time more forcefully than before. The boy froze. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall, and a familiar voice, one the boy had only heard a few times outside of school, broke the silence. "Stop right there." The boy turned, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway was someone he hadn't expected to see. Someone whose presence in the school had always been more of a mystery than a known fact. It was his uncle, a man who worked in administration, but rarely showed up at the school unless something serious was happening. And when he did, it usually meant bad news. The principal stiffened at the sight of him. "What are you doing here?" His voice was controlled, but the underlying tension was undeniable. The boy's uncle didn't wait for an invitation to enter. He stepped forward, his face tight with urgency. "I need to talk to you. It's important." The principal's eyes narrowed. "This is not the time. It's about your son," his uncle snapped, his words cutting through the room like a blade. "I just got off the phone with the district office. You need to hear this before you make any decisions." The boy felt a cold shiver run down his spine as his uncle's words hit like a thunderclap. His son. The boy's heart raced. What could this possibly have to do with him? He tried to make himself as small as possible, his gaze flicking back and forth between his father and his uncle. His father's expression had changed, the mask of control slipping just slightly as his uncle's news began to sink in. "District office." The principal's voice was low, tight. He took a step forward, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "What are you talking about?" His uncle's face was pale, his eyes full of something the boy couldn't quite decipher. Fear, perhaps, or worry. "I didn't want to bring this up, but it's bigger than you think. You've been blind to what's been going on here. We all have." The room felt like it was closing in. The boy felt his breath quicken, his thoughts spinning. What could his uncle possibly mean? His father, his rock, the one who ran the school with an iron fist. Blind. It didn't make sense. His uncle turned to face Miss Carter, who had remained silent, watching the exchange with growing concern. "We've been getting anonymous complaints about the way things are being handled here. Teachers, students, even parents are starting to feel like the school isn't a safe place anymore. It's not just about one mistake, it's about a pattern." Miss Carter's face grew paler still. "What are you talking about? I'm doing my best to keep things under control." His uncle shook his head. "You may not know it, but the cracks are starting to show. And your father, he's been too focused on the little things. He's missing the bigger picture." The principal clenched his jaw, his face going red with anger. "I'm not the one who's missing anything here. You're the one jumping to conclusions." But the boy could see it now. Something was off. His father's reaction wasn't just about Miss Carter or the glue incident. It was about the deeper issue that was suddenly being dragged into the light. The room, once calm, now felt like a pressure cooker ready to explode. The boy didn't understand all the details, but he could feel the rising tension, like a storm cloud gathering overhead. His uncle's voice dropped to a low, urgent whisper. "There's something you need to know. The district is investigating complaints against the school, and they've been watching you too." The principal's eyes darkened. "What are you insinuating?" The boy felt his stomach lurch. The idea that his father, the principal, was under investigation was terrifying. His father had always seemed untouchable. He was the one who enforced the rules, not the one who broke them. The boy had never questioned his authority, but now, with these words hanging in the air, doubt crept in. Was his father really as untouchable as everyone thought? His uncle stepped closer, lowering his voice even further. "It's about the way you've been handling things, the way the school's been run. There have been whispers about your methods, about the pressure you've been putting on the staff, and the way things have been escalating behind closed doors." The boy looked at Miss Carter, who had gone rigid, her eyes wide with shock. She was listening now, fully aware of the stakes. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as everything around him seemed to spin out of control. His father took a deep breath, visibly trying to maintain his composure. "If you're trying to sabotage me, you're doing a poor job of it. I've built this school from the ground up. No one's going to take it from me." "Not sabotage," his uncle countered, his voice tense. "But this isn't just about a single teacher's mistake. This is about something much bigger, something that's been growing over time. And it's going to hit hard. You're not going to be able to control this with your usual tactics." The principal's expression darkened further. "If this is some sort of conspiracy, you'll regret it." The boy felt his heart race even faster. His father, usually so sure of himself, was faltering now. The walls of authority he had built around himself seemed to be crumbling with each passing second. The boy had never seen him this vulnerable before, and it terrified him. His uncle's eyes softened for just a moment, almost pitying. "It's not a conspiracy, it's the truth, and it's coming whether you're ready or not." The boy was on the edge of something he couldn't fully understand, but the unease swirling in the room was undeniable. The conflict had escalated. The stakes had risen. And now, everything seemed to be unraveling. No one seemed to have control anymore, not his father, not Miss Carter, not even his uncle. And the boy, caught in the center of it all, couldn't help but feel that the worst was yet to come. The tension in the room was unbearable. The boy's heart raced as he watched his father's face grow darker with each passing word from his uncle. His mind couldn't keep up, trying to process the growing tension, the secrets being laid bare. His father, the principal of the school, the man who held everything together, was now unraveling before his eyes. The boy's thoughts raced, but nothing made sense anymore. How could it have come to this? How could everything they had built together come crashing down so quickly? The principal's voice cut through the air, his words sharp and bitter. "Enough of this nonsense. I won't listen to any more of your accusations." But his uncle was relentless, and now the boy could see the cracks in his father's once unshakable resolve. His uncle's eyes glinted with something almost like relief, as though he had been waiting for this moment. "It's not an accusation, it's the truth," his uncle replied calmly. "You've been blind to it for far too long. The school's foundation is weaker than you think. The cracks have been there for years, and now they'd finally started to show. You've pushed the staff too hard, ignored the complaints, and now you've got more than just Miss Carter to worry about." For the first time, the principal's gaze faltered. His usual composure cracked, revealing something much more fragile beneath. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment, everything felt suspended in time. The boy, watching the scene unfold, suddenly realized something. His father wasn't as infallible as he had always believed. All his life, he had been taught to trust in his father's authority, to believe that everything was under control. But now, standing there in the midst of the storm, he saw his father for what he truly was, a man, just like anyone else, with his own flaws, his own fears, his own limits. "I won't let this school fall apart," the principal finally said, his voice low and dangerous. "I've worked too hard for this. You can't just come in here and tear everything down." But his uncle wasn't backing down. "It's already falling apart, and you're the reason. You've been too focused on your own power, your own control. You've neglected what really matters: the students, the teachers, the community. It's all slipping through your fingers." The boy could feel the weight of the words, the gravity of the situation settling over him like a heavy fog. His father, who had always been so steadfast and certain, now seemed vulnerable, like a man who had been holding up the sky and was finally too tired to keep going. The principal's eyes flicked to Miss Carter, who had been standing motionless, her face pale and her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had been silent, but her presence in the room felt as though it were hanging over everything. It was clear that she wasn't just a bystander in this drama. She had been at the center of it all, and her fate was intertwined with his father's decisions. "Miss Carter, you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into," the principal said, his voice now colder than ever. "This isn't just about glue in a child's hair. This is about a system that's been failing for years." Miss Carter flinched, but she didn't speak. The boy could see the panic rising in her eyes, but there was something else there too, something he hadn't noticed before: defiance. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. The principal turned back to his brother, his jaw tight with anger. "I've done my best. I've built this school from the ground up. I've created opportunities for these kids, for the teachers. You can't just tear it all down because of a few complaints." His uncle's gaze softened, but there was no mercy in it. "It's not just a few complaints. It's a system that's rotting from the inside out. You've been so focused on holding on to power that you didn't see it slipping away. People are talking, and they're not talking about a little mistake with glue. They're talking about everything. How you've run this school, how you've treated the staff, the kids. It's all coming to light now, and it's too late to fix." The boy's stomach twisted as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. This wasn't just about Miss Carter. This wasn't just about one small mistake. This was about the whole school, the way things had been handled for years, and the consequences that were now beginning to catch up. His father wasn't just being called out for one incident. He was being exposed for a pattern of poor decisions that had been building over time. The boy glanced at Miss Carter. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her expression. There was something like understanding, a shared recognition of the mess they were in, but also a strange calmness. She wasn't going to back down, and neither was he. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, to break the suffocating tension in the room. But before he could speak, his father's voice rang out, sharper than ever. Enough. I won't let you destroy everything I've worked for. But the boy's uncle didn't flinch. You've already destroyed it. It's over. The boy looked at his father one last time. He had always admired his father's strength, his unshakable presence. But now, as the weight of the truth pressed in, he saw the cracks in that armor. He wasn't the invincible figure he had once believed him to be. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for something to happen, something to give. And then, just as the boy thought the world would collapse around him, a voice broke through the stillness. Miss Carter's. Mr. Reynolds, I'm sorry. I know you think this is all my fault, but you need to understand something. I wasn't the only one who messed up. We all have a part to play in this, myself included, but I won't let you take the blame for everything. I'm willing to fight for this school. I'm willing to fight for what's right. Her words hung in the air, a sharp contrast to the anger and resentment that had filled the room. The boy felt a sense of clarity in her words, like a light breaking through the clouds. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he realized that he didn't have to choose between his father and Miss Carter. They were both flawed, both human. But maybe, just maybe, they could both find a way to fix what had been broken. The principal stared at Miss Carter for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, finally, he let out a long breath and said, I've made mistakes, but I'm not done yet. The room was silent again, but this time, the tension was different. It wasn't just a waiting game anymore. It was a realization that things could be fixed, that the school didn't have to fall apart, that there was still a chance for redemption. But the boy knew one thing for certain. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain. But whatever happened next, it was up to them all to rebuild together. The air in the office had shifted, the weight of unspoken words lifting as the tension slowly began to dissolve. The boy, still processing everything that had happened, looked around the room. His father, the man he had always admired, was now just another person in the mess that surrounded them. His uncle, usually a figure of authority and mystery, seemed different now, less the villain and more the bearer of difficult truths. Miss Carter, though shaken, had proven something important. She wasn't going to back down. And somehow, amidst all of this, the boy found a quiet sense of relief. His father was no longer the unyielding force that everyone had once believed him to be. His weaknesses were out in the open now, but so were the possibilities for change. His uncle had exposed the truth, but it wasn't the end. It was a turning point. The boy could feel it. The school, his father, even Miss Carter, they all had a chance to start over. But only if they were willing to confront their flaws and work together. The principal, now calmer but still holding a fragile sense of control, finally spoke again. I can't promise that everything will be fixed overnight, but I will do what it takes to make things right. I owe it to the students, to the teachers, and to this school. I owe it to you, too, he said, looking directly at Miss Carter. She nodded slowly, her face still pale but determined. I know things haven't been perfect, but we can make them better. We can start fresh. It'll take time, but I'm willing to put in the work. The boy felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this wasn't the end. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. He could see it in his father's eyes. He was struggling, but he was open to change. The trust he had once held so firmly had been shaken, but it hadn't been completely broken. There was still a chance to rebuild, to move forward. The boy didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever happened, he wouldn't be facing it alone. As the meeting drew to a close, the tension that had once filled the room seemed to evaporate, replaced by a cautious optimism. The boy watched his father shake hands with his uncle, the Cold War between them finally thawing. The principal turned to Miss Carter and said, I'll handle the district office. We'll work together to fix the issues they've raised. We'll be better. I promise. Miss Carter gave a quiet smile, though the strain on her face remained. "I'm glad to hear that. I want to make this school a place where every student can thrive. I believe we can do it." The boy, standing quietly off to the side, felt the weight of the conversation settle on him. He had been part of something much bigger than he had realized. This wasn't just about glue or one teacher's mistake, or even one principal's fall from grace. It was about the larger picture, the school, its community, the future of everyone involved. And despite the chaos, despite the tension, he could sense the possibility of a brighter future. As his father and uncle wrapped up their conversation, the boy found himself at a crossroads. Everything was different now. The foundation of his life, of his understanding of the world, had been shaken. But in that uncertainty, there was a kind of clarity. He didn't need to have all the answers right now. Sometimes, the most important thing was being willing to move forward, to rebuild even when the pieces felt scattered. As he made his way toward the door, his father caught his eye. The principal's face softened, the usual sternness replaced by something more vulnerable. "I know this hasn't been easy for you, son," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But I hope you understand. This isn't just about the mistakes. It's about learning from them. And I want to show you that even when things fall apart, we can still rise up." The boy nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. It wasn't an apology, but it was enough. His father wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And that, in its own way, was all that mattered. As the door closed behind him, the boy felt the weight lift off his shoulders. The school year wasn't over yet, and there was still so much work to do. But for the first time in a long while, he believed that things could change. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Everyone had been shaken. Everyone had been forced to confront their mistakes, but that was only the beginning. The journey toward healing and rebuilding was just starting, and as for the boy, he knew that he would play a part in that change, however big or small. Outside the office, the boy took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs. The world hadn't ended. It had just shifted, and in that shift, there was an opportunity. An opportunity for growth, for redemption, for making things right. His father had taught him the value of strength, of control, but now he was learning something even more important: the strength to change, to admit when things weren't working, and to take the first steps toward making them better. He looked back one last time at the office doors. For a brief moment, he thought he saw his father standing in the window, watching him. There was a new softness in his father's gaze, a kind of understanding that hadn't been there before. The boy smiled to himself. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And for the first time, he felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they could face it together. As the boy walked away, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. It was Miss Carter, catching up to him. She smiled, a small but genuine smile, and he returned it, knowing that together they would help rebuild the school into something better. And as for the boy, he was learning that even in the face of mistakes and unexpected turns, there was always a chance to start again, a chance to rise, to change, and to build something new.